South Florida, including Miami-Dade County, has voted mostly Democratic during the last few decades in presidential elections. And in fact, since 2018, 2 of the 3 members of the House of Representatives representing Miami-Dade neighborhoods are Democrats. Nonetheless, there is a persistent public perception that the Cuban American community tends to strongly vote Republican and in favor of the policy of embargo against Cuba. According to the 2016 FIU Cuba poll, a leading poll representative of the Cuban American community in Miami-Dade County, 81.5% of the persons interviewed responded that the embargo on Cuba did not work at all or did not work very well. Moreover, 63.2% favored ending the embargo. The majority of those who left Cuba after 1980 and those younger than 75 years old supported the end of the embargo. The responses were given in August before the November presidential election. 2 years later, the 2018 FIU Cuba poll showed that 83% of the participants said that the embargo on Cuba did not work at all or did not work very well. However, 51% of the participants now said that they favored continuing the embargo. Moreover, only a majority of those who came to the United States since 1995 opposed the embargo. Since 2018, young Cuban-raised media celebrities in Miami-Dade with pro-GOP discourse have mobilized newer Cuban and Venezuelan immigrants residing in South Florida who were previously disengaged with politics. This recently developed partnership closely resembles the Trumpian style of politics as performance. The GOP has attracted new young Latino voters in Florida through these local celebrities by exploiting their sometimes justified frustrations with their own governments in the region. At the same time, these sensationalist celebrities have found powerful allies in members of the Florida GOP. Therefore, it has not been a surprise to South Florida observers to see a spike in right-wing messaging mixed with misinformation, and conspiracy theories. Ironically, while advocating a boycott of any rapprochement with the Cuban government, these new immigrants are the ones who with the closest ties to the Cuban society. The average consumer of new right-wing Cuban-American media was raised in Cuba, usually travels regularly to Cuba, and sends remittances to their families in the island. The same could be said about the Venezuelan American community. It is a pleasure for me to have a distinguished panel to talk about these issues. Each panel will have 15 minutes and later we'll open the floor for comments and questions. Please write your comments and questions in the public chat and I will read them for the panel. With me tonight is Emily Mendrala, Professor Eduardo Gamarra, and Professor Ernesto Dominguez. Dr. Ernesto Dominguez is a full professor and coordinator of the U.S. Study Group at the Center for Hemispheric and United States Studies, CESEU, at the University of Havana. He's also the coordinator of the master's program in the U.S. Studies and American Geopolitics at the University of Havana. He has been a visiting scholar, visiting professor, and guest speaker at several universities in the United States and Europe. Emily Mendrala is executive director of the Center for Democracy in the Americas. Before joining CDA, Emily was a director in the Legislative Affairs Directorate at President Obama's National Security Council, where she advised the National Security Advisor on legislative matters pertaining to Latin America, Europe, Asia, Russia, nuclear proliferations, and multilateral affairs. She worked on Cuba and Central American policy at the Department of State, and before that, served as a professional staff member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, advising Chairman Kerry on Latin America, global women's issues, foreign assistance, and trafficking in persons. And Professor Eduardo Gamarra is a professor of political science in the Department of Politics and International Relations at Florida International University. He directed the Latin American and Caribbean Center, LAC, from 1994 to 2007. And in February 2016, he was appointed founding director of the Latino Public Opinion Forum at the Stephen Green School of International and Public Affairs. Gamarra obtained his PhD in political science from the University of Pittsburgh in 1987. Throughout his career, Gamarra has conducted research and served as a political consultant in several Latin American countries. In addition, he has testified several times before the US Congress. Most recently, Gamarra's holdings has focused on the Latino vote in the United States. I will give the word, I will start with Professor Ernesto Dominguez, and we will later move to the other panelists. Thank you.
Okay, good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure for me to be here, and I'm very thankful for the organization of this webinar and the possibility in this important panel on this important topic. I think a moment in which having any sort of academic discussion at all is a win when we consider the global situation in every country, the US and Cuba in particular. And of course, technology, if it helps, it is okay. If not, it's a big problem that sometimes we have to circumvent certain restrictions. So it is really, really a pleasure and a huge luck for me to be part of this panel. I want to talk a little bit about the elections, coming elections, and in which situation Florida is, and the voters, particularly the Latino voters, in that state, and how this may have an impact or not in the upcoming elections. First of all, and I think it's very, very well known that Florida is a very, very important state. In just a few words, it is just the biggest swing state in the U.S. Therefore, it can be decisive in elections. And it's a condition that is becoming even more so with the growth of the population led mostly by Latinos, other minorities, and of course the permanent inflow of people coming from northern states moving southwards, looking for a better weather for them or something like that. But anyway, the consequence that Florida is growing, its population is growing, and therefore its participation in Congress and the size of its electoral college is growing and will grow in the foreseeable future. And of course, we know that it has had the shortest, the slimmest margins in presidential elections for years. 2000 was kind of the peak of that behavior, but it has been the case for many, many years. The other part, the other major condition, the major health factors that are conditioning the current situation and the coming elections is, in first place, a reality that sometimes is forgotten or neglected by media and other commentators, which is the U.S. is going through a major transition that happens to affect every area, every aspect of human life. I'm talking about transition that is connected to demographic change, not only connected to emission, but the dynamic of the groups that exist in the U.S. In the so-called minorities are growing when compared to the traditional white non-Hispanic communities, and major impact on identity and on, of course, the self-representation and the way in which different groups understand their position and their role in the United States. And of course, it also has to do with the actual distribution of power and resources among these communities, which generates a significant degree of contradiction and what conflict on them. Another major component here is the important transformation of economic structure, which started decades ago, which is associated to the transition to a knowledge-based economy in which traditional manufacturing industries disappear. And one of the reasons why a very important swath of the population, mainly the traditional post-war middle class that essentially was formed by working class that increased their social status, improve the social standing, is in significant decline. And of course, that generates a significant degree of reaction towards this situation, which many of them consider have been run by the system itself. I'm sorry for a second. And in line with this, there is this decline of the middle class have triggered a high level of social protest. Not only the protest against racial injustice that is very well known recently. Yeah, have been covering a lot of these protests around all state, but also the 2010s protests against, for example, the bailout for the banks and the policies that were enforced to cope with the crisis back then. And we have to consider Tea Party or by Wall Street and other movements as part of this social reaction, social protest. Within that general framework is that we need to place the current crisis that the US is living. Referring to, of course, the pandemic, the COVID or SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, which is essentially sweeping all the whole world, and the US being the more affected, the most country in terms of numbers, in terms of all going, and its immediate consequence, economic crisis. There are many details, of course, but I probably know all of these details. But the idea is that there is a combination of long-term trends, long-term processes, with a very specific situation triggered by the crisis that have created a situation in which many people are talking about millions and millions, essentially most of the population, and of course, each state population in each state are in a condition of uncertainty about the future, a condition of certainty about what that future will bring for them, and they are demanding policies of different kinds. The problem is that those policies are not the same because, of course, their interpretation, which is largely shaped by the media they consume, the information they receive, the opinion makers that essentially influence on those populations, on those different groups, are giving them very different, not only views of what is happening, but interpretations and process of what should be done to go with this situation. And in the midst of that, we have the elections, and then we have Florida and the communities within Florida. Communities in Florida, which is very well known also. The population in Florida is formed by, among other groups, by a very large number of Latinos, which is one of the biggest Latino communities in the States. But it is different by due to position to most other Latino communities, due to mainly, of course, the presence of the Cuban community, which have been the big one, but even more important than that, have been hugely influential, structurally on the ways in which politics is carried out in the state, in the ways in which policies are in influencing the general elections, influencing federal policies. Luis was mentioning some of this at the beginning when he was talking about Marco Rubio and all politicians in the way in which they have presented themselves in very real terms. They control very important sector policy based on the influence they may have in this important. Of course, they have been also very skilled in maneuvering within the system and using the rules of the game at different levels to advance into agendas. In that sense, it's very interesting something that I was mentioning also, which the very composition of that Cuban American community. Yes, there is the old guard of the community, those who are back in the 60s, back in the 70s, all the way to the 80s. And I will tell that probably the turning point in that history is more the 1990s than 1980. 1980, yes, broke the Marilito sign number of over 120,000 Cuban Americans Cubans who went to the United States in those years. But structurally speaking, those are underrepresented in most of the dominant groups and within the elites in the Cuban community, and they're often rejected by Cuban Americans, which is a very interesting project. Cubans who arrived after 1995, they have a very different sense of why were they immigrating to the United States or immigrating to the United States. This is was mostly an economic migration, not necessarily a primarily political migration. We changed the community dynamics and, of course, the relationship with Cuba. And that is why we can safely say actually, that there is a very important community that, not because they have the support the Cuban government, but because of the relation they have with their families and friends in Cuba, because of their own interests. They may have, certainly many of them have, a view of what a Cuban policy should be, and they may support politicians with projects, proposals that tend to change that reality, change those policies. That's the idea of have the blockade, as we call it in Cuba, or as we call it in the US, have worked or not. That's part of the story. So it depends on what they understand as working not, which are the goals that they have, what are the aspirations that these people have, and the ways in which they understand these policies help or not those. And there is a problem, and you were mentioning the signs that we have. It seems that there is a new generation of immigrants. I will put the starting point, which is always combined, somewhere around 2013. Why? Because of the change in the Cuban migratory law and the ability that many Cubans gain with that, of moving back and forth within the two countries without losing residency in Cuba and having the possibility of obtaining American residency, and having the possibility of either making money in Cuba, which some of them have had, or just come to visit the family, whatever. The problem is that there is a significant growth, apparently, if we believe social media and the way in which they present themselves and how they are, we're going to probably see people have gained a significant space in Florida, these young Cuban Americans, which many of them probably are not citizens yet, probably most of them. Many of them are not registered voters. They do have the possibility of speak to community and to be heard by this community. And this is a very important thing. The reasons for this are difficult to pinpoint. There are many possible factors. We're going to be could speculate about it, and I have some ideas. But the important part is there is a change in this sense. The problem is, and the final idea here is that we are witnessing a very important process who may decide a significant part of the future of the United States and the world in the midst of a huge transition, of important transition process, in the midst of a huge crisis. In a state as important as Florida, in which the population is changing, political preferences and behavior are changing too. So we have a huge level of uncertainty, and I guess that everything is possible at this point in that state and in the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Ernesto. Emily?
Thank you, Luis Carlos. And thank you, Meg, Gretchen, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be on this panel. I'm honored to join. I was tasked with speaking about Florida and the candidates' foreign policy views toward the region with a focus on Florida. And a quick caveat that I'll be speaking in my personal capacity tonight. And I'm going to go ahead and echo something that I just heard Ernesto say, that Florida, and I'm sure we all are thinking about this, is the nation's largest swing state. It's probably the reason that one of the reasons we're having the webinar today. It is top of mind for Democrats and Republicans. It always is, but especially in an election year. Wooing Florida's voters is arguably a chief motivator in both domestic and foreign policy decisions for the incumbent and platforms for the candidates. Just this week, for example, we're tracking reports that President Trump may nominate a Cuban-American judge from Florida, Barbara Lagoa, to fill the Supreme Court vacancy left by the passing last Friday of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And when it comes to foreign policy that matters to Floridians, policy toward the countries of the Americas definitely tops the list. As I said, I'll talk about the two candidates' foreign policies toward the region. I'll look first at the campaigns and then turn briefly to predictions on what their actual foreign policy would be, the stuff of governing, starting in 2021. For the campaign, between now and early November, what can we expect? A lot of focus on Florida. President Trump will travel to Florida Thursday for a campaign rally in Jacksonville. I understand he may be in Miami on Friday. Vice President Biden was there last week, Senator Harris the week before, both of them in Florida. The margins in Florida's elections tend to be super close. So expect candidates to target each of those margins repeatedly for turnout and undecided voters. The second presidential debate A town hall meeting will take place October 15th at the Adrian Arch Center for Performing Arts in Miami. I expect a strong Florida focus there and issues that matter to Floridians at that debate. In the campaign for President Trump, as is always the case with the incumbent, he has more tools at his disposal to court Florida voters. Even though current US government officials are prohibited by law from participating in campaign activities, the policies and positions of his government will nevertheless reflect on him and his candidacy. And as such, there's been a lot of high-level recent action on US foreign policy in the Americas, and we should expect more before the campaign. Just in the last week, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo traveled to Guyana, Brazil, Suriname, and Colombia on a trip focused on Venezuela. Yesterday, Secretary Pompeo announced new sanctions on Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro, accusing Iran and Venezuela of having worked to flout the UN arms embargo, which makes Maduro now doubly sanctioned. And expect more policies, announcements, sanctions, appointments on issues that resonate in Florida. It's also worth mentioning Cuba specifically. The administration has made several announcements, several policy changes to, in the words of President Trump, reverse the last administration's completely one-sided deal with Cuba. And there's a whole host of regulatory changes, the framework of rules that govern the implementation of the embargo that can come in the months to come in areas such as travel, trade, remittances, and other financial transactions, that though their practical impact may be small, or maybe not so small, but not easily discernible in some communities in Florida, they could nevertheless be messaged with great fanfare in Florida. So watch that space. For Vice President Biden, his tools are somewhat more limited to policy statements, speeches, social media. While he doesn't have the full force of US government policymaking behind him, he can rely on his surrogates. One example there's been some negative press recently around a perceived inability for the Biden-Harris campaign to appeal to Hispanic voters. But the narrative is starting to change, and some of the credit for that shift can go to diaspora groups like Cubanos con Biden and Venezolanos con Biden, who are giving interviews to Miami-based journalists saying things like, "We are not going to be manipulated by allegations of socialism." Vice President Biden also has travel as a tool, and expect concerted campaign outreach to Venezuelans, Haitians, Puerto Ricans, Cubans, and more. And they will also be faced with, as Ernesto said, combating disinformation. There have been several press reports about disinformation campaigns attempting to discredit Vice President Biden. When it comes to governing, starting January 2021, what can we expect? Both candidates have a record to look to, so we can base some of our predictions on past precedent, but it's also worth considering special scenarios, either for a Trump second term or a Biden president, given circumstances and events that we'll find ourselves facing come January 2021. First, I'll share a little bit about what we know about each candidate's approach. For President Trump, he has been very focused on the region, significant focus on Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, the so-called troika of tyranny, so dubbed by then National Security Advisor John Bolton. Several speeches delivered in South Florida, including one last April, delivered by John Bolton at the Bay of Pigs Veterans Association, where he announced policies to, quote, boldly confront the evils of socialism and communism in the hemisphere, similar to language that we're hearing in current campaign slogans. Sanctions have definitely featured prominently in the policy toward the troika countries, again, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. The administration has also been laser focused on migratory flows, and the policies of the administration toward Mexico and Central America have been almost singularly focused on curbing those flows. It's also worth mentioning that President Trump was the first sitting US president to forego attendance at a summit of the Americas, the first one since the inaugural meeting during the Clinton administration. Vice President Biden also has a long record to look to. He has focused most recently as vice president on clean energy and climate resilience in the Caribbean. He's focused on Central America, a comprehensive and sustained commitment to addressing root causes of migration. In the Senate, he was known as a leader on Plan Colombia and issues to combat drug trafficking throughout the Americas. As vice president, he did not do much on Cuba, despite being at the White House during the Obama administration's focus on normalization. He did not travel, for example, while cabinet secretaries and much of the Obama administration was seeking opportunities to travel to Cuba. As far as Vice President Biden's campaign promises, he has made commitments to continue a commitment to Central America and the Caribbean along the lines of his record as vice president. For Cuba, he's committed a return to policies that allow for the flow of information, goods, and people between the U.S. and Cuba, and a focus on the Cuban people and Cuban families. A look quickly to events that would make 2021 unique, that either a Trump or a Biden administration would inevitably be faced with at the beginning of 2021. First and foremost is the COVID-19 pandemic. Latin America is the hardest hit region in the world. 8.7 million cases reported, 322,000 deaths. The pandemic is likely to, according to predictions from economists, push 45 million more people into poverty. There's talk of another lost decade in Latin America and the Caribbean as a result. And our health response and our economic recovery will be inevitably intertwined with the rest of the Americas. Also, stemming in part from the pandemic, most experts assess that there will be a surge of migration at the US-Mexico southern border in early 2021. And finally, the Summit of the Americas will likely happen the second half of 2021. We set the agenda, and we could also find ourselves in a scenario where the world could travel again, and that could be an incredible opportunity for a US administration in 2021 to set a strong and a bold agenda for the Americas. As is often the case, however, Latin America will be competing for airtime on a crowded agenda, but I think the Latin Americanists among us will make the case that these are tier 1 issues and deserve early and constant attention. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Emily. Professor Gamarra?
Again, I wanted to simply thank Luis Carlos for organizing this. I had the privilege of having Luis Carlos as my student a few years ago, so all the good things that he does are my responsibility. You know, this is of course, as Emily was saying, a lot of the debate today seems to be focused on Florida. In fact, over the last few weeks, I have spent the better part of my days talking to journalists from all over the world, asking the very questions that are being addressed by this panel. And I think it not only demonstrates the importance of Florida, but also the relatively uninformed way in which most people look at politics in Florida. And so in some measure, I'd like to address some of those issues. And so again, I think Emily did a magnificent job in setting the stage, and I want to commend you for your capacity to synthesize such an awful lot of information in a few short minutes. I hope to do halfway as well as you have, but the reality is as follows. Florida politics are extraordinarily complex. We have multiple media markets, and we tend to focus on Miami-Dade largely because of the significance of the Cuban American population. And over the years, you know, the focus on how much influence the Cuban American population has had on politics in some measure distorts the significance of other groups, and even distorts the way in which Cuban Americans have been behaving politically in the state. The narrative, of course, and it's generally correct, is that Cuban Americans, since at least the 1990s, have been, since at least the 1980s, have been extraordinarily significant in the making of domestic politics, but primarily in the making of US foreign policy toward Latin America, most specifically toward Cuba, right? this idea that sort of the filter through which the US sees Latin America passes through Miami, and it specifically passes through the very significant role that the Cuban lobby, as it's generally called, has had in Washington. That narrative is partially correct, and but it also, in some measure, reveals something quite interesting, which Luis Carlos mentioned at the beginning. The last candidate who won Miami-Dade County, the seat of Cuban-American political power, was George Bush father. Every other Republican president, Republican candidate since has lost the presidential race in Florida. And most significantly, let me address something, for example, that we saw specifically during the Obama years. We began to see a very significant shift of Cuban American voters toward the Democratic Party. And in fact, much of the research that many of my colleagues, Lisandro Perez among them, had been doing and sort of predicting was that, right, if you look at the different waves of Cuban immigrants to Miami, we had begun to see sort of a shift away from the Republican Party. And the prediction was, of course, every generation that comes into Miami is going to become a little bit more liberal, right? Younger Cuban Americans, those born here, are going to tend to be much more liberal and therefore leaning much more towards the Democratic Party. That pattern appeared to be correct in the 1990s during the Clinton administration. But Elian presented a very significant about face for many here in Miami, especially among younger generations, who all of a sudden identified Democrats again, right, with the gran traición of the early 1960s, when air support for Playa Girón did not occur during the Bay of Pigs. And so we began to see sort of a lull in that move, that generational shift, which follows the pattern of most immigrants, perhaps. We began to see a lull, and especially with the election of George W. in 2000, the controversy that emerged in 2000. But here's the interesting thing about the 2000 controversy, right? That George W. lost by a fairly large margin in Miami-Dade County, right? And that, I think, is really a very, very significant statement about how Cuban Americans in this community have been behaving really about national politics in general. It's a very different thing to look at local politics, however, right? Local politics in Miami has been largely dominated by Cuban Americans. And Cuban Americans dominate local politics for a couple of reasons. One, there are 1.3 million Cubans in Florida. Approximately 600,000 of them are US citizens and are eligible to vote. So they constitute the single largest voting bloc in Florida. And when in the surveys that I've done and that several of my colleagues have done, right, that the shift there, which we measured very carefully in the latter part of the 90s and during this decade, right, probably up to 70% of Cuban Americans at one point identified with the Republican Party. And that dropped dramatically, especially during the Obama administration, to close to 50%. And so, again, those predictions of this rapid migration toward the Democratic Party would eventually seal the fate of the Republicans even at the local level, right? But what we find is really quite interesting, that at the local level, right, Cuban Americans not only participate, Cuban Americans have an extraordinarily high voter turnout rate. It exceeds the pattern of voting among white Americans, right? And that, I think, is very noteworthy, even during midterm elections. For example, in November of 2018, Cuban Americans had an extraordinary turnout rate in some precincts here in the Dade and Broward counties. So Cuban American behavior is distinctly different than the behavior of other Latino groups in Miami, and certainly in Florida, and also in the United States. Let's just look at the contrast, for example, in terms of voter turnout among other Latinos. Other Latinos in the United States generally participate in national politics at a rate of between 46 and 49% on average, right? A very low voter turnout rate. So if we think that, we are approximately 32 million Latinos today eligible to vote in the United States, we're probably only going to see between 13, maybe 14 million Latinos turn out to vote this year, right? And that's going to be a good voter turnout. So the Cuban American contrast then is extraordinary. It's extraordinary in the sense that they've organized around the Republican Party, and they turn out to vote for national elections, and they turn out to vote for local elections. Thus, in some measure, it is their concrete behavior that has made them so significant in the making of policy toward, not only toward Latin America, but certainly policy in the United States. So having said that then, and moving very quickly, this trend, as I said, that appeared to sort of slow down with Elian and then really kind of, return under Obama, right? In fact, I think, if you look at both Obama terms, right, especially here in Miami, there was really very few reasons to think that the trend toward Democrats, especially younger generations. In fact, Luis Carlos, if you go back to the Cuba poll, right, really documents how Cuban Americans since 1991 had been liberalizing their positions on a range of issues. You mentioned the embargo, and that's probably the most telling one. In fact, the two surveys that you mentioned, and the data that you mentioned, very clearly reflects how this community, right, far from rejecting the Obama administration's opening toward Cuba, in fact, readily accepted it, right? And encouraged it. And especially sectors that you might even consider, conservative sectors of the business community that became fully engaged in Obama's policies towards Cuba. So it's very noteworthy here, that trend was really moving in a direction that today then is quite surprising, right? It's quite surprising because had we continued to predict the way we were, the opening of relations with Cuba was something that, yes, there were groups in Florida and in Miami that were extraordinarily opposed to that shift. But there was also a very large number of Cubans. We think the polling in the FIU Cuba poll demonstrates that there was widespread support for Obama's policies toward Cuba. And then I think it's also important to note that in his very parting, month, President Obama did something which the Cuban community had wanted here very badly, especially the leadership in Cuba, in the Cuban American community. In fact, Senator Rubio and also in the House, the Cuban representatives had introduced legislation to effectively do away with dry foot, wet foot, right? Something that one would assume would have enormous political repercussions in this community. But it was being, in fact, spearheaded by the conservative Cuban American representatives in both the Senate and in the House. And it's important to understand why they were doing that. They were doing that largely because there was a sense that Cuban American recent arrivals, first and foremost, as Ernesto noted, were primarily economic refugees. They were coming into Florida. They were taking advantage of social services. Once they got their parole papers, they were going back and forth to Havana, and that was creating this extraordinarily negative sentiment. It was dividing the community. So in a way, you see, the final parting shot of President Obama was to essentially hand President Trump an enormous favor because it was something that the Republican leadership in Congress had actually been trying to push, and it believed that if those policies had gone through, the Republicans would have probably taken it on the chin. The fact that Obama did it made it more something that now, today, in fact, in the midst of Cubans being stopped at the border, in the midst of Cubans being treated exactly the same way every other immigrant, every other undocumented immigrant is, the fact that we are deporting Cubans, right? Last year, 760 Cubans were deported to the island, right? Now this administration is essentially saying, we're doing that because, right, this was Obama's idea. This was the Obama administration's policies, right? And that has some measure, had an effect here. Not to say that, that there is still some degree of how should I put it, contentment that these massive waves of Cubans that were coming and taking advantage of our social services is over, right? So I think it's important to look at those two things as the background here. This shift toward the Democratic Party was very clear. It was palpable. It was documented in a number of surveys. And then came Donald Trump in 2016. And I might add, Donald Trump lost Miami-Dade by 270,000 votes. Not only did he lose Miami-Dade, but he lost decisively in some very significant Cuban American districts, right? Especially where the I would say the higher income Cubans were, right? And Trump did very well in unincorporated Dade, and that I think is very, very interesting, right? So, but we find something quite interesting, right? That in 2016, right, there wasn't this dramatic love affair that today Cuban Americans have with President Trump. In fact, something that we also documented in surveys here was that phenomenon of the shy Trump voter, right? With Hispanics, not only Cubans, but many Hispanics essentially refusing to say that they would vote for Trump because they were afraid of being embarrassed in front of others, right? And we saw that in focus groups. We saw that certainly in some of the surveys that we did, right? So there was kind of hidden Trump votes there that weren't catching. Today, I venture to say that there probably is a similar phenomenon, only the other way. Today, there is kind of a shy Biden vote. There is a shy Biden vote, especially among some Cuban Americans, but also certainly among Venezuelans and among Colombians, right? Who in the environment that we're living, a very pro-Trump environment, they hesitate to admit that they will vote Democratic. So then let me just finish very quickly here, so that I return this to the moderator. We have been doing weekly tracking surveys of how Latinos vote nationwide and in Florida, and I've been doing this 2016 with a company called Ads Mobile, and we're finding some fairly interesting patterns. We're finding, for example, that nationwide, Latinos are not as enthusiastic about Vice President Biden as they were about Hillary Clinton, and certainly not as enthusiastic as they were about Obama. And we're finding that that trend is perhaps a bit more pronounced in the state of Florida, and it's more pronounced even in Miami. Having said that, right, and having said that, and this is extraordinarily important, right, Cuban Americans in our surveys, about 55 to 60%, that range, say that they will vote for President Trump. Okay, and when you look at this in terms of the other groups, right? And one of the things that a lot of people are speculating about, and we have found no real evidence, is that that Venezuelan Americans are also identifying at those levels with the Republican vote. I'm probably the one person who's been surveying Venezuelans more than others. And I have yet to find a survey where Venezuelan Americans are not voting for Biden more so than they are for President Trump. All right. What I am finding, however, and this is important, that the gap, that the range is narrowing. That today, almost 40% of Venezuelans are identifying as Republicans, which is a significant increase from the 25% or so that we saw earlier in the Trump administration and certainly in 2016, right? So I've seen some surveys that, frankly, I don't like to criticize my competitors and certainly not my colleagues, but if you do just the basic math, right? First, the Venezuelan American population is not as big as people think, right? It is in fact a very small population of voters. Let me just give you one concrete example. Doral has about 42,000 in population, right? Doral has, according to the supervisor of elections in Doral, September 1st, approximately 29,277 voters, right? In surveys that we've done, we ask obviously about national origin, and approximately 20% claim to be Venezuelan. Let's assume that we're talking about 30,000 voters. That would mean that there are 6,000 Venezuelan voters in Doral. Okay, and in Doral, the vice president does fairly well and defeats President Trump by almost a 10-point margin. Right? These are in the Ads Mobile surveys that we've been doing. Right? So this becomes a very important point of discussion. Right? How far other Latinos are moving. And why is it significant to note that slight movement of Venezuelans for Trump, or Colombians for Trump, or Puerto Ricans for Trump? And Puerto Ricans are an entirely different issue. Because in the end, as Ernesto pointed out, and as Emily has pointed out, Florida's importance lies in the fact that the Republicans can probably not win the presidency without winning Florida, right? And the route to the White House for the Republicans without Florida is a much more difficult one, right? The route for the Democrats is also goes through Florida, right? But probably the route for the Democrats outside of Florida is easier than for Republicans, still very difficult. So because we have a winner-take-all system, and because those 29 electoral votes are handed out according to winner-take-all, right? It doesn't really matter, as Emily noted, right? Whether it's one vote or 1 million votes. Note that Trump won by 120,000 votes, and that his votes were mainly from the North, and they were mainly white votes. They were mainly rural votes, right? So it doesn't matter, any group is going to be able to claim, Venezuelans might be able to claim, it was our votes that put President Trump over the edge, right? Or certainly Cuban Americans may. But by the same token, you could say Puerto Ricans, or you could say any other group, because in the end, this is a summation game, right? So are Venezuelans, given their small size, important? Yes, but only in the context of understanding how the electoral system works, right? So I'll leave it there. I'm sorry I went on for so long.
Thank you, Professor. Always a pleasure to listen to you. I will take the privilege of being the moderator, and I will ask a question to the panelists. Recently, we have seen reports that Russia and China, they have promoted messages inside the U.S. electorate. And how likely is that other countries, specifically countries and parties in the region, they could try also to influence the Hispanic community in Florida, given the relevance that the state has, as you as pointed out. So I'm thinking not just about Cuba or Venezuela, but also parties and governments of Brazil, Colombia, South America in general. We're seeing also a question by Natalia Delgado, and she asks, what is behind the pro-Trump environment now in Dade County? And also another question by Professor William Legrande. He says, recent polls suggest that long-term trend in Cuban Americans becoming more moderate, as measured by FIU's Cuba poll, has reversed since Trump's election. How do we account for that? Trump's hyper hostility towards Cuba, the crisis in, I'm sorry, I lost the question. The crisis in Venezuela, reigniting old members, social media influencers like Otaola. And I will, let's leave these questions here and we'll go for a second round. Who would like to respond first? Professor Gamarra or Emily, Ernesto? I think Professor Gamarra first.
I'm first? Yeah, I just dominated the conversation for longer than I should. Look, I think there are, and Professor Leo Grand's question is really a very important question, because as he notes, you know, and we have documented over the years here, and in every survey that I have done since 2012, we were looking at that, you know, moderation. In fact, as I said, you know, the Cuba poll also documents support for Obama's policies. So why this dramatic reversal, right? And I think, you know, it's going to be hard to explain even in the aftermath of November the 3rd. But I think there are a couple of things that are important. One is the fact that, and let me illustrate this by the following. Marco Rubio, right, whose headquarters are in Doral, right, lost in Miami-Dade County in 2016. All right, this is what a number of people don't really understand, right? And one might even argue that Marco Rubio won because of the coattails of President Trump in North Florida, white voters and so on, right? And so now clearly, you know, Cuban Americans voted for Rubio. There's no question about that. But he lost in his own district, and I think that there's a couple of things that are very, very important. The Republican Party has something that Democrats don't. They have organization and they have resources. And they have been targeting the recovery, the recuperation, if you want, of these districts, right? Probably for a very, very long time. And so they've spent an awful lot of effort here in Dade County, an awful lot of effort. And that means that they've been paying attention to this community. And above all, right, they've been paying so much attention that Marco Rubio became essentially the guru of U.S. foreign policy toward Latin America, right? And especially toward Venezuela. More importantly, you know, other Cuban Americans became very, very significant in U.S. policy toward the region. One of the most important, of course, is Mauricio Claver Carron, who's now the president of the IDB, right? And let me just plug one of my students who's finishing her dissertation on the influence of Cuban Americans in the making of foreign policy, your topic, Emily, right? And she did a nice little survey among Cuban Americans here, and, you know, basically asking, under which administration did Cuban Americans have more influence? And she has found that the perception is that Cuban Americans have had the most influence under Donald Trump. More influence than Cuban Americans had under Reagan, certainly under the Bushes, certainly under the Clintons, and certainly under Obama. So they, to a certain extent, feel validated, and Cuban American leadership here feels absolutely validated. The second thing, when you talk about attention, I've lost count of how many times Donald Trump has been here, or Pence, or any other one of these administration officials. And this is in very, very sharp contrast to the Democrats. Unfortunately, from my perspective, right? The Democrats have paid very scant attention. In some measure, even Democratic pollsters in certain campaigns have told me, we're not even going to worry about the Cuban Americans because that's a vote that we're not, we can't win, right? Even though there's probably 40% of the Cuban American vote that's absolutely decisive in terms of the outcome in Florida, right? So again, I think it's attention and extraordinary amount of resources that have been spent on this community by the Republican Party, and the Democrats are simply catching up, right? The 100 million that's coming from the Bloomberg organization, great, wonderful news. Too little and probably too late, right? So that's kind of an anecdotal way of responding that, because we don't really have any more significant data, other than the fact that, again, among Cuban Americans now, they're recovering the old version of themselves, right? Again, when we ask questions about support for the embargo, the new Cuba poll will be coming out soon, but there is now increased support for the embargo. There is increased support for not renewing relations with Cuba, right? So we now are seeing, empirical evidence that this dramatic shift in public opinion has occurred here.
Thank you, Professor. Emily?
I have some questions for Professor Gamarra. I'll drop them into my comments too. So the next time it's your turn to speak, maybe you can address them. It's curious that the perception is that Cuban Americans have had the most influence during the Trump administration. I wonder if it's not also the reality, if only judged by the number of appointments to high-level positions. You mentioned a couple, but I think there are high-level Cuban American appointments at State Department, USAID, throughout the multilateral banks, the Organization of American States, in the White House. It really has been impressive, the extent to which the Trump administration has incorporated Cuban Americans into the leadership structure. And I'd also say, in addition to resources, that the Republicans have demonstrated a remarkable amount of message discipline as well. We could see it coming when all public remarks referencing Cuba policy also included a reference to Venezuela, and all public remarks referencing Venezuela policy included a reference to Cuba. And very shortly, the two were linked as one, and they were coupled in U.S. foreign policy apparatuses, but also in the messaging of the Trump administration targeting Florida. And the follow-on, the natural follow-on to that was the narrative that, and the scare tactic really, that all Democrats are socialists, and it followed on from that very, very targeted foreign policy focus of the administration. And so I guess in somewhat response to Natalia's question, what's behind the pro-Trump wave in Dade County, I think I would say to some extent it's that. It's been the message discipline. It's been the it's been the foreign policy approach of the Trump administration, with an eye toward Florida all the while, coupled with travel, high level engagements, etc.
Thank you, Emily. Professor Ernesto?
There is a couple of things that there are many interesting things to talk about, and my colleagues have made a good job in presenting most of them. So I just gonna mention a few things. First of all, I'm quite sure that perception about the influence of the Americans on the administration is actually the highest they've ever had, just counted by the number of people that is in positions in government or whatever. Around in the years of George Bush administration, there were up to 200 Americans in different positions, including a Secretary of Commerce, Carlos Gutierrez. So, I mean, I'm not saying that it was bigger back now, but hard to measure. In terms of why there is a pro-Trump environment in Florida, particularly Miami, in the surrounding areas, I will say that there is a very important role played by the so Cuban American political machinery, which is something that was counted back that Alejandro Borges have used in some of his work. And this is one of the things that differentiate the Cuban American community from other Latino communities, particularly from the Venezuelan community or the Puerto Rican community, the fact that they have an organization and they have resources that they use, and they are savvy in the way in which they use it. They know how to use it. That is very important of building influence on politics in the state and at the local level. It is, I think, very important what Emily was mentioning, that the narrative about Cuba and Venezuela have been feeding each other, kind of a feedback loop in the process, in which every time you mention Venezuela and the other way around. And I think all this narrative is mostly conservative Cuban Americans, even more than Venezuelans, given that Venezuelans actually play a more role in Florida, why, given the numbers and the difference in resources, etc., etc. I want to point out, which I think is interesting about the political discourse around this election, which is, if you remember, back in the time during the Cold War, Cuba and the Eastern European countries, the Soviet Union, were referred to as communist countries, and it was about communism. However, for the last couple of years, in the political speech, coming from Trump, coming from John Bolton's time, and others, there have been a switch in that sense. They began to use the term socialism and socialism, and they have been connecting that usage of the word to, of course, the progressive win of the Democratic Party, Bernie Sanders and AOC and others, and more recently have expanded that to include Joe Biden, which is not even close to be anywhere near socialist, and a few others, even Obama in his time was labeled as socialist people, and they have been connecting that to the version of socialism that exists and the attempt of version of socialism that exists in Venezuela. So you can think part of this environment, particularly among the Cuban Americans, the Venezuelan Americans, have to do with this presentation of the rivals, political rivals, as people that want to bring that brand of socialism into the U.S., which is of course not true, but that's the way in which they have been fed. And there is also the problem that, and I think people were mentioning, my colleague were mentioning, that large part of these communities are not well informed in the sense of having reliable sources of information other than those provided by these groups and organizations that do agenda. And you know, in Miami, some media outlets, they have that agenda, and they have been feeding the queue with all this narrative, and that's part of it. And of course, there is, I think, this new way of Cuban Americans, those are have the podcast and the YouTube channels like Otaola, for example, like the biggest one. They have created a sort of an environment, ecosystem of those online media that have advanced in this narrative and this agenda. I don't know if they have any financial. I really don't know if they have a financial connection, different connection to these other groups. Well, there is some evidence of that, of course. It's way more complicated to demonstrate that to the last detail. But of course, that is very plausible, and this is people that feed in a sector community that is not the traditional one, that is falling in line with the more traditional view on Cuba, radical way of addressing Cuba, And at the end, I think the effects are already visible, though maybe not as much as some people think that it is. Because of course, you know that social media and the way in which it behaves is different from reality to some extent. So we have to wait and see how this translates into votes and translates into political behavior other than being online and speaking about it and shouting about it and screaming about it, which is a whole industry. The meme industry, the meme industry is around there, is that machinery that is renovating itself, is renewing itself, is reinventing itself. I think that's a major component here in the creation of this Trump Biden and anti-democratic environment.
Thank you, Professor Dominguez. We have other questions, one from Gretchen Sanchez. She says, we have seen in recent days a number of articles addressing disinformation in Florida, mainly in Spanish radio programs. How will that affect the outcome of this election? And Arturo Lopez Levy has a question for Emily. During the last 2 years of the Obama administration, Democrats changed the policy towards Cuba, but they left intact the U.S. government subsidized pro-embargo machine in South Florida. They even didn't change the personnel at Radio TV Martí. It is such a surprise that in the middle of this campaign, they are engaging in such disinformation and harassment of providing positions. And also for Dominguez, Arturo Lopez Levy is asking, is there any policy the Cuban government could have taken to make more difficult the policies of isolation against Cuba promoted by the Cuban American radical right? Let's go with Emily first. Emily?
Great. First to Gretchen's question, I'm not sure. It's not an area that I've studied closely, disinformation. I'm curious to hear what other panelists think. I think, my very uneducated view is that the fact that it's being publicized and called to account with a month plus left before the administration is good and should continue to happen to the extent that people are aware that these disinformation campaigns are out there and are targeting them. They can be savvy to the campaigns and recognize fact from fiction. To Arturo Lopez Levy's question, am I surprised that radio and TV Martí are attacking policies of normalization? No, I'm not surprised. My personal view is that there needs to be a pretty thorough review of radio and TV Martí programs, policies, personnel. And this speaks a little bit to Harold's question in the other chat, that despite normalization efforts, Democrats have supported and funded Miami-based groups focused on regime change in Cuba. And the question is, if the Biden-Harris ticket is victorious, can we expect a change in federal support to these groups? And how can Democrats stop supporting radical right-wing Cuban Americans and not look soft on communism? I think that's a great question. And I think in addition to radio and TV Martí, the democracy promotion programs will all come under review in the spirit of hopefully a new approach toward US policy toward Cuba, and that there can be alignment in that policy from regulatory changes that govern trade, travel, and flow of goods, information, and people, all the way down to democracy promotion programs and radio and TV Martí. And furthermore, that our policies could let Americans engage with the Cuban people, not so much picking and choosing groups within Cuba to receive US government support, but rather let there be people-to-people exchange and happen organically.
Thank you, Emily. Ernesto?
Yes, the question of the disinformation and this impact of all this process, I think an important one. I think that we have somewhat hinted that question. The problem is that all of the, like for example, the presentation of presenting Biden the socialist is already from information, and I think that it's difficult to measure the specific impact of each of those different media that disinform the population, of course. It's hard to determine that level of impact. Certainly it is there, And I think this is just kind of a educated guess or something like that, that large part of these Cuban Americans, they, at least significant parts of them, they have distrust toward what they perceive on what official media, some of them who arrived 2 days later, they may have distrust, they may distrust this media because they compare it to Cuban media, which many of them reject as a source of information. And there is something at the anecdotal level is quite visible. And that may be play a role and then may be considered, it's not official media, but is perceived as to be connected to political groups and political parties in the US and others as sort of semi-official media that they may somewhat not consider a reliable source of information. And then you have all these different groups. And recently I was talking to a friend is connected, is watching my friend Anjo Richingani, which I think connected. And we're talking about QAnon and the way in which they have had an impact on the Latino community, simply among Cuban Americans. There is some evidence that had an impact. To what extent and how this will influence the elections or not, that is yet to be seen. But I do think it is playing a significant role in this environment and creating sort of potential behavior among Americans. Details are to be researched, to be studied. And regarding my and I'm friend Arturo Lopez Levy and his what could have done by the Cuban government to help to prevent these outcomes. It is to say because one thing would have been, for example, to promote even more than there have been some policy about it, but to promote and to open more room for private investment in Cuba, for example, to open room for Cuban American investment in the island, which, by the way, recently there was a document that was published a few weeks ago in which this is part of what is included, the idea of allowing simulating investment by Cubans, living or not, live in Cuba or not. So this is open for this, and there have been some policy documents and some legal documents in that direction. But of course, I'm not quite sure that there would have been time to advance in this sense in at the point that the current environment wouldn't have affected and wouldn't have created this situation yet. I do think that is much more a question of information, but I agree that a policy of engagement and opening room for the initiative and maybe creating stronger between the Cuban American community and Cuba and its population in the island, we have helped to prevent at least part of this process. I don't think that all of it, maybe not most of it, but at least part of it. Would that have been possible? That's a different question, which I think it's not that easy to answer. Probably the answer is perhaps not. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Ernesto. Professor Gamarra, would you like to add something?
Okay. I would like to add something because I think this has been a very rich dialogue about these issues. And let me just go back to something that Emily said, which I think is extraordinarily important, but I think it needs to be expanded a little bit. And that is the message discipline of Cuban Americans and the message discipline, especially about the Republican campaign. And why do I say that? I mean, if you go back to the November 2018 midterm elections, right? Here you had some really fascinating issues that should have been Democratic ground, and it should have been fairly easy to go against somebody like who is today the governor, DeSantis, because of his links to President Trump and so on. But it was a campaign that the Democrats lost, and they lost decisively. right? They lost a senator, right, to the former governor who spent an awful lot of money. And most of his money, in fact, was largely devoted to Spanish language ads. Governor Scott, then, now Senator Scott, spoke something like Spanish, right? And had an enormous amount of influence in Miami. You know, and he had an enormous amount of influence in the Orlando area, right? In some of the polling that I did with Puerto Ricans, for example, it was quite significant how name recognition was tied really to those commercials, right, to those spots. And 40% of Puerto Ricans voted for Republican candidates. And that's something that, you know, really was a striking revelation, given the fact that so many Puerto Ricans had arrived. They're U.S. citizens. As soon as they arrived, they could vote. And so, you know, the expectation was that they were going to vote Democratic. And that, you know, there are also 1.3 million Puerto Ricans. They should just simply, you know, counterbalance the Cuban American vote. But if you have 40% of Puerto Ricans voting for Republicans, there goes your difference. Okay, so that's point one. But the message specifically, and this, you know, to Ernesto and to Emily, is really important to try to understand. And there are two elements of this. One is the fact that the Democrats have been absolutely terrible at messaging on the violence in Nicaragua, right? The situation in Bolivia with Evo Morales, and the situation with Nicolás Maduro, and especially the humanitarian crisis that affects us deeply here, right? So you're correct, the coupling, Cuba, Venezuela, you know, Venezuelans, when you interview Venezuelans, they will tell you the large presence of Cubans in that country. And they believe that, you know, the entire intelligence apparatus is Cuban. The entire military is run by Cubans. Maduro is nothing but a puppet of the Cubans. That's the message. And it's a very important message. And when you see the images on television and you see the UN Human Rights Report and so on, and when you basically see, right, that the messaging that comes from Democrats is a messaging that came out of Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders, right? Basically, you know, not wanting foreign interference in Venezuela, not wanting to condemn Evo Morales' fraud in Bolivia, and no mention of Nicaragua, right? That really has an impact in this community. And it has an impact that really, you know, ratifies the perception of Cuban evilness in the region, right, among Cuban Americans. But now it's really gone into the other Latinos. Surveys of Colombians, for example. What's the number one issue with Colombians today? It's communism. It's socialism, right? It's the threat of Venezuela, right? This is extraordinarily important to understand in terms of the messaging that the Democrats have essentially blown. And let me just add to that, because, you know, I think I'm a Democrat, and I think we've blown the message. We've blown the message because we appear to be endorsing Maduro. We appear to be endorsing electoral fraud in Bolivia, right? And these are three instances in which 12 Democratic senators sent a letter, right, condemning, you know, basically supporting Evo Morales, right? We have essentially, as I said before, not taken a real stance on the atrocities committed in Venezuela, and of course this is where for example, in the Gillum DeSantis campaign, Gillum was endorsed by Senator Sanders. That was essentially the kiss of death for Gillum, right? An African-American candidate who should have had, you know, a fairly easy time bringing over minority voters, but he lost. And he lost very badly, as a matter of fact, right? Much worse than any one of us expected. And so that messaging, by the way, worked. It worked because they essentially made Gillum into a socialist. and as Ernesto said, they're not calling them communists, even though there was one commercial, one spot where they had, sort of they had a picture of Marx, they had a picture of Lenin, and then they had a picture of Gillum, right? That he was the continuation of these great, philosophers of Marxism, right? So that messaging has worked and it has continued. And what I do want to stress again on that is that, when you look at these issues and how they've become so important in the presidential campaign, it has to do, interestingly, with Black Lives Matter, right? We had by comparison, a small experience with Black Lives Matter in Miami, but it was enough because the messaging that came out was the messaging of a young Dominican woman with a Venezuelan flag who was arrested, in some of the turmoil. And when she was asked, well, where, then pictures surfaced of her being greeted by Maduro. And so the narrative was, you see, here we go. This is what the Democratic Party is about, right? This is the Venezuelans funding the riots in the United States. And by and large, what you're seeing in a lot of the social media messaging today is that the Black Lives Matter movement is dominated by, communists, socialists, right? And that Biden has been, very closely linked to them. And of course, now simply by virtue of race, Kamala Harris as well. And so this is evidence of how Black Lives Matter is going to essentially dominate, the way in which this administration will do a couple of things. It will defund the police, all of those messages. A couple of weeks ago, something very important happened in Bogota. They had an incident similar to the Black Lives Matter situation. Most of you are familiar with it, right? In which two police officers beat a young attorney to death, right? The violence that ensued, right, in a country deeply polarized, largely between Uribistas and non-Uribistas, has taken on a new life here in Miami as well, right? Where a lot of the messaging that you see in social media is, you see, this is now being exported, right? This is Black Lives Matter in Colombia. It's the socialists. And it doesn't help that the former, socialist mayor of Bogota, Petro, says that if he was an American, he would vote for Biden, right? All that does is it solidifies these perceptions of how the Democratic Party is so closely linked to communism. Of course, it's all bunk, right? But when you don't have a disciplined counter message that works, and that goes to one of those questions on the chat, how do you counter message that? It's extraordinarily difficult. You can say, look, Biden won the primary. Biden is not Ocasio, and he's not Sanders. That hasn't worked effectively, right? There has to be some way in which the Democrats can counter that image. And part of it is, for example, very simple things that I think the Democrats could have and should still say. One, they don't favor defunding the police, right? Apart from saying, no, we're not socialists, which is an obvious thing. But I think a stronger condemnation of Venezuela would certainly help, right? A much stronger condemnation of Venezuela would certainly help. And they might start by looking at the most recent human rights report from the UN.
Thank you, Professor Gamarra. I see several questions from Anju Resangani. I will ask two questions that they haven't been discussed. One is, has the Trump administration's white supremacist rhetoric been as impactful with the white Cuban Americans population as it has been with other ethnic whites? And the second question is, how do Cuban American leaders in the Republican Party reconcile Trump's racist rhetoric with their symbolic leadership of a multiracial community? Let's start with Ernesto.
Yes. These are these are also interesting questions, like all the questions and all that are around. There is something about I'm gonna go in reverse. There is something about the Cuban American, especially American elite, in which the problem of race is something that they inherited because there is also a history about race in Cuba. And remember that structurally speaking, the Cuban American community was created by early immigrants back in the 60s. And this included most of the, not saying that every who immigrated in those years was part of those. This included the upper and upper middle classes in Cuba prior to the revolution, which in every other country in Latin America, these people, they consider themselves mostly white. So in many senses, I'm saying that this is the only exception. In many senses, many of these leaders of the Cuban American leaders, they don't see themselves exactly as multiracial. They see themselves as white because they come from a background in many cases where they were raised in a background in which being white was part of their identity, of white Cubans, their identity. And in many cases, this comes from talking to other Cubans who are doing some field work in Miami. It is quite common among Cubans, especially the old guard Cuban American community, but not all, to see themselves as different from other Latinos in many ways, including racially, including culturally. So that means that for them, problems like multiracial, the multi-race character of the Cuban population, the actual diversity of the Cuban population at large, and also in Miami, is not something that they have included as part of their identity. It is hard to determine to which point this is the way in which they interpret their own reality, they identify themselves, but it's definitely part of the problem. And also, there is this also opens the door for being more attracted to the white supremacist movement and rhetoric and message and narrative than other groups, Latino groups, especially when, particularly in Miami, the Cuban American community have had a much better situation for a long time than other Latino communities and essentially almost all your immigrant community states. So that's part of the problem. And many of these people see that this is something that there is even jokes about it, that you cross the line and then you look and say, I want my country back as country. So basically changing their mind right away from an immigrant to become part of the country, especially when they have special treatment in the early times. Recent the recent wave of immigrants coming from they have surged in this reality. And there's also the fact that the Cuban history for the last few decades, actually, than that, is different from the history of all the countries in Latin America in many different ways. And of course, Cuban society have behaved in a way that is different in many of these countries. Education is different. The issues that they were exposed to were different in many cases, or in most cases, than when compared to other countries in the region. So when you see that, I think that the makeup of the community and the way in which they see their identities are affected by these realities. In that sense, many of these Cuban Americans are, in a way, at least they see themselves as closer to those conservative white Americans than to other minorities for many reasons, including those. By the way, there is also anecdotal evidence that I have compiled for the last couple of years, seeing younger, my age and younger Cuban Americans that are considered themselves whites and expressing themselves as deeply conservative, even people that arrived here in the last few years, in the last 5 years or so, expressing on media as very conservative, pro-gun, anti-Black Lives Matter, and of course, they pepper that with anti-socialist, anti-speech. So we cannot, and this is my final point here, and I think is a very important line. We cannot separate race attitude. We cannot separate political behavior. We cannot separate voting behavior of groups or the messaging from the very complex reality of community and different communities interact among us between themselves, but they are connected to reality that is outside the United States and which they see critically, at the same time they cannot detach from. And we cannot separate that, we cannot that from the reality of a country, in this case the United States, that is going through a major crisis in which their position of all these groups in society is threatened by many different factors, including new other minorities. And many of these people, I think, are reacting also to that in many different ways.
Thank you, Ernesto. Emily?
Thanks, Luis Carlos. I don't have a ton to add other than just a reflection on the last question posed by Anju, which is how do Cuban American leaders and the Republican Party reconcile Trump's racist rhetoric with their symbolic leadership of a multiracial community? I don't know. It must be difficult, and I wonder, and I suspect that after November, perhaps after January, in a Biden election scenario, that some of that may come to light. But I don't expect that any of them are inclined to talk about it before November's election.
Thank you, Emily. Professor Gamarra?
That is a difficult question, and we have tried to uncover that a little bit in some polling, but you know, what we find is something quite interesting. That to a certain extent, Ernesto mentioned this, right? Look, if you look at some of the Pew data about Hispanic Americans in general, a very high proportion of us considers, you know, we consider ourselves white, right? And it's really only when you get to the United States and you realize that you're not white because everybody else, you know, classifies you as not white. But then when you look at the specific numbers, I think it's 48% of Latinos who classify themselves as white, all right? That's a very big number, right? And I think it's important, not that, you know, not because people who perceive themselves as white identify as white supremacists or, you know, but when you look back home, right, we come from very, very divided societies. We come from very racist societies, right? And so sometimes what you find, especially in focus groups and so on, are some expressions that you know, you might even be comfortable with them back home, right? But when you hear them expressed in the United States, they fit into an entirely different narrative. And to a certain extent, you know, the whole logic of political correctness that the Trump administration and, you know, and so much of the Republican Party have essentially targeted over the last few years is in some measure legitimating some of the attitudes, some of the discussion. And I see it particularly in this, I think all of you saw the Political article on disinformation, right? But you see it especially now, and it had disappeared in Cuban radio, right? But in Cuban radio, now voiced by some Venezuelan, let's call them journalists, okay? Which I don't know if it's because they haven't been told, you know, that we did have a civil rights movement in this country and that some things you simply can't say on air. But there was in fact a very good article by Tim Paget from WLRN, our local NPR station here essentially, said that, it's high time that the Miami, Cuban American and other Hispanic elite, we are the majority in this town, take some responsibility for this. Because the incitement, that you're hearing in some stations is really going to generate violence. That was essentially Tim Paget's message, and it's one that I think is a very powerful one. Because the fact that they're taking, QAnon stuff, which gets diffused, by the way, Ernesto, the most important social media mechanism here is really not YouTube per se. It's WhatsApp, right? I know it's kind of a discovery by people who don't live in Miami that WhatsApp is important. But here it's WhatsApp. If you don't, if you're not WhatsApping, then, that's how the messages get transmitted. And certainly the same thing happens in Latin America with campaigns. So it's very important to understand how WhatsApp then gets picked up by radio stations, right? And panelists discuss these theories and give them validity. And then when they hear the president give them validity, right? Then of course it becomes absolute truth. And so then it becomes perfectly acceptable to discuss in mainstream media, right? And you've got several. I mean, one of the most important personajes down here is a Peruvian named Jaime Bailey. I don't know how many of you ever watched a full hour of Jaime Bailey, right? But part of what he does is very similar along those lines. Well, he appears to be a very, very sophisticated author and so on. At the same time, he says some atrocious things, not only about the United States but about everywhere, right? And again, it's part of this this narrative where a conspiracy theory becomes reality by virtue of the fact that it goes through these legitimating processes. But I think the worst part of the legitimacy, who's giving credence to this is the president. And when the president and his functionaries are responding in ways that, that essentially authorize these communities to reproduce that message and to pass it off as true, right? That's why it's easy to believe that Biden is a communist, right? The president says it, right? It's easy to believe that there's a, George Soros, by the way, right? George Soros is universally hated in Miami, as he is universally hated by the more conservative sectors of just about every country in Latin America, right? He's funded every possible, evil thing. And of course, underlying that is a very anti-Semitic message, right? And also underlying that, is of course, the one thing that's been very, very, very big in the airwaves recently are the accusations of corruption against Biden's kids, against Biden's son, right? That first of all, I don't know if it's true. He's never been to court, but here he's been tried and convicted, right? And again, where does it receive validation? In the messaging of the campaign. So I think it's not so much, Ernesto, that there's, yes, there's this legacy of racism that we bring here and that we need to relearn some behaviors. And hopefully our children aren't going to reproduce those. But I think it's also the fact that we've had such a regression in the United States over the last 3 years. And now the fact that our president, it's not a fringe group saying these things, it's our president who's saying that. That gives validity to anything that can be said by even the most extreme person on radio stations here. And I will say that the two groups or so, the Proud Boys and others who are here, Cuban American white supremacists, so to speak, right? They are absolutely exceptional. They are an absolute minimum group, right? So I think it's very, it's equally dangerous to paint the Cuban American community as a whole as a collection of bigots and as a collection of extremists, because they're not, right? Because they're not. They're, let me just tell you, that, I think they are conservatives, right? And in the context of American democracy, they have a place, just like I think progressives have a place. But we're now in such a polarized environment that we have essentially wiped out the middle. So the dialogue that's possible has virtually disappeared. And in a sense, I don't see that the possibility of recovering that middle ground, especially if a Republican victory takes place. And there I've said it, right? If the Republicans win the White House in November, the possibilities of healing our community and other communities, I think, even further disappear, because the possibility of reconstructing the center is essentially going to be gone.
Thank you, Professor Gamarra. I think the last two questions, they have been addressed unless you, the panelists, want to comment something else. Gretchen said, recently Cuban Americans influencers such as Otaola have said that they changed the outcome of the election. Would you attribute any value to these influencers? How is the political polarization until the moment? What would you expect in the coming month? And Natalia Delgado asked it to Professor Gamarra, with the time left before the election, what is the most important message and how should it be expressed and through what venue? Would you like to start, Emily?
Sure, and I'll reflect a little bit on what some of the other panelists have said too. I just to express dismay a bit that the fact that the middle has been wiped out, and especially it's to be expected during campaign season. There's not much room for nuance, but when we find ourselves in a position of governing, of not being in campaign season, it is, and it would be a shame if it continues, that there's no room for nuance. And I think, one of the calls I would make to, recommendations I would make to whoever our president is in November is that they infuse a lot of nuance that's been missing in U.S. policy toward the Americas, and approach countries for who they are and the challenges that they face, approach problem sets with respect to U.S. national interests, and not paint the region with a broad brush of kind of black or white, but allow a lot of room for gray. And I recognize that that's not the stuff that wins elections. It's not the stuff that can be compressed into sound bites with disciplined messaging for an electorate that's busy and has a hard time. I'm guilty of it in other issue areas as well. Busy, I consume sound bites, and I'm finding myself swayed by them as well. But I'd say when it comes to U.S. policy toward the Americas, would urge a lot of nuance, a lot of consideration for a different approach, and would ask the communicators to do the work of making that into something that is sellable, I think, because it's the right approach, and if messaged correctly, it could win voters.
Thank you, Emily. Ernesto?
You're muted.
Now? You hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. So first, I'm not a political statist, so I won't even try to say that's for Professor Gamarra. It's him to say what should say their messaging so they could help case in Florida. I agree, by the way, with what you said, that the Cuban American community is a diverse one, so you should not paint it with a single. There are many different groups, and extreme groups are always minorities. I would say that always minorities. But the problem is that the moment in which others, they permit these groups to have a central role, So in a way, supporting this in many ways, even if they don't do it actively. But that's down the point. One of the main problems here, and I do think it is very important, is that polarization as a reality has been growing in the U.S. at the very least in the 1970s, and probably since before that date, at the political or the elite level, which have been measured over time, many times. There have been a discussion about if the polarized or not, but there is at very least 20 years of evidence that that polarization is growing, if not steadily, at least trend is to increase polarization, political polarization over time. And this, of course, in every community, not only a nationwide, not only the white American, the white non-Hispanic American population, but every group within the United States is polarized in that sense. That's one thing. And then the other thing is, and I think I mentioned this earlier, being in a crisis, which is very clearly going on. The pandemic, the economy is not well right now due to the pandemic, but also due to the much deeper structural problems. Of course, there are groups that have been suffering that longer than everybody else. In those conditions, to be polarized, kind of a normal behavior. And if history, you're gonna see different levels, different degrees, different specific messages, different specific political proposals. Is part of those. A moment of crisis, and that the middle ground, this middle that is gone, that have disappeared, is disappearing quickly, is connected to a consensus that's now broken. So right now, and we can rely on the version of the realignment theory in which we have to build a new consensus based on adjustment. The political actors, their projects, their programs, their proposals, to find a new middle, a new center of the political spectrum that may be acting as a Dacian system or something similar to that. But to that, you need to restabilize the system at large. And everything that we've been discussed so far, I think is tantamount to expressions of that break in the consensus and the competition and the conflicts around. Consensus will emerge from this process. In that context, Cuban American community, the Venezuelan American community, the Puerto Rican community, and others are but part and pieces in a much larger game.
Thank you, Ernesto. Professor Gamarra?
Yeah, just very briefly, is Otaola important? You know, he's a curiosity, right? More than anything else. He's extreme, he's radical, but in the end, you know, he's an actor, and he's found a way to make a fortune here. He's been in the US for 17 years, and he's made a fortune. And he's made a fortune by being absolutely outlandish, right? It's part of the, you know, the American way, so to speak. He says some crazy things, and in many ways, you know, it reflects more his upbringing in Cuba than here, right? Because he has some extreme views that are you know, that certainly aren't democratic, right? Small d. And so, you know, how much of a following does he have? I mean, you know, he has a lot of followers on his YouTube channel. Is that, you know, going to be mobilized into voting? I think it's, you know, simply part of the landscape here. It's not really that heavily, you know, I doubt that more than his followers know him, right? And so that's important. I mean, does he make noise? Yes, he does make noise. But I wanna also ratify a couple of things, right? When Senator Harris came to Miami, she stopped at a restaurant, unscheduled, right? She just stopped there. Now, whether it was planned or not, I don't know, but it was unscheduled. And they stopped and they were met and they were greeted and they had this wonderful talk and so on. And the result was, of course, that a lot of activists in the community began to boycott that restaurant. Okay, just like we have seen over the last few years, members of the members of the Venezuelan government, who just happen to have homes here and and so on, right? Are identified in restaurants and they're harassed, right? And so what I'm trying to say here is that the exiles who are here are much more radical than the voting population, but they do have an influence on them, right? And that's where I think we need to really understand that the size of the Venezuelan community is large, but not the Venezuelan voting population. But this is the group that makes a lot of noise, and it makes a lot of noise precisely on social media, precisely on the radios and so on. So there is an influence there. It's difficult to measure. Emily, you probably know better about how to measure messages than I do. But I think, I see those messages having an influence on the way people think. But again, I just want to go back, and I think, this is probably the last thing I'll say, that, I am worried because I think the shift in other Latinos, as small as it may be, right, could be the difference in the state of Florida. And that worries me enormously because I don't think that the reconstruction of the middle is possible, because if that victory occurs, then it's essentially an endorsement of the patterns of intolerance that we've begun to see, not only in Miami, but throughout the United States. So that worries me enormously, right? At the same time, I'm, as you know, Luis, I've been teaching here for 35 years, and I've had mainly Cuban American students. And I'm extraordinarily proud of the accomplishments of my students, including you. One of my students was Barbara Lagoa, for example, right, in the late 80s. And so this is a community also that is extraordinarily proud of, their successes, their enormous successes in working through this. And they see, to a certain extent, and this is why the messaging is so important. They believe, whether it's correct or not is a different issue, but the Republicans have been able to convince them that the American dream is about to end if they elect Biden, right? What a terrible and wrong message, but it's the one that's had such repercussion in certain sectors of this community. So again, Emily, you were very diplomatic, and I think that's your role. But I am worried, and here I'm giving away all my objectivity. But I am worried, very worried, that if Florida goes Republican, right, that what your caution, we need nuance. This is going to be a very unnuanced world. And that worries me. And it's going to be a very unnuanced foreign policy toward Latin America as well.
Thank you, Professor Gamarra. It's been a pleasure for me to listen to you again in one of your classes, basically virtual classes. I would like to thank also all the attendees, Professor Ernesto Dominguez, Emily Mendrala, also some esteemed colleague and former boss of me. And again, I would like to thank ELAS and the Cuba program led by Margaret Crahan for organizing this as well. Thank you again to each one of you for for participating here, and it's been a pleasure to listen to you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure.